Marcus Ellington adjusted the strap of his weathered leather guitar case as he approached the airport security line. The hum of conversations and the rhythmic clang of luggage wheels on tile filled the air, blending into an oddly soothing background. He glanced at the time on his phone, plenty of minutes to spare before boarding. Airports, after all, were familiar territory for him. A musician's life was one of constant movement, a perpetual dance between places that blurred together. But this morning felt different. The line moved slowly, each traveler funneling through the TSA checkpoint under watchful eyes and weary sighs. Marcus stepped forward, placing his shoes, belt, and carry-on into the gray plastic bin. He did so with practiced ease, his actions precise and deliberate. He knew better than to seem hurried or uncertain in such spaces. "Step to the side, sir." The voice came from a young TSA officer whose crisp uniform and neutral expression gave little away. For a moment, Marcus thought nothing of it. Random checks weren't uncommon, and he'd been through them before. But as the officer gestured toward a separate screening area, a quiet discomfort settled in his chest. "Is there an issue?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but curious. "We need to inspect your belongings further," the officer replied, avoiding direct eye contact. Another officer joined them, holding what appeared to be a printout. The two exchanged words in low tones, their expressions tightening with each passing second. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation: suspicious item, anonymous report. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus kept his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed, though his mind raced. Around him, the crowd's attention shifted subtly. Travelers craned their necks, curiosity flickering in their glances. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing in his direction. The officers began their search, meticulously examining every pocket of his guitar case, every zipper of his backpack. A quiet tension thickened the space, though no one spoke it aloud. It was the kind of tension Marcus had felt many times before but rarely discussed. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the far end of the security line, where passengers collected their items and moved on. For them, this was a minor inconvenience, a necessary step on the path to their destinations. For Marcus, it was something else entirely, a mirror reflecting back the quiet, persistent weight of being seen as an outsider, even in the most mundane of spaces. The search yielded nothing unusual: a spare set of guitar strings, a book he'd been meaning to finish, and a travel-sized toiletry kit, all unremarkable. Yet the officers continued, their movements slower now, as though reluctant to admit there was nothing to find. "Everything looks clear," one of them finally said, his tone almost begrudging. Marcus offered a small nod, his face unreadable. He didn't ask for an apology, he knew better than to expect one. Instead, he gathered his belongings, slipping his shoes back on with deliberate care. As he walked toward the gate, the murmurs of passengers followed him like shadows. Some watched with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled suspicion. Few seemed to wonder about the toll such moments might take on a person. He paused briefly near a large window overlooking the tarmac. Planes taxied in the distance, their white fuselages gleaming against a pale morning sky. Marcus took a deep breath, grounding himself in the rhythm of his own heartbeat. This was not new, he reminded himself, and yet, each time, it carried the sting of something old and unyielding, like a splinter too small to see but too deep to ignore. Somewhere in the distance, an overhead announcement called his flight number. Marcus tightened his grip on the guitar case and began walking again, each step steady and unhurried. He had a plane to catch. After all, the cabin was a sanctuary of sorts: rows of tightly packed seats, soft overhead lighting, and the quiet hum of engines that promised forward momentum. Marcus Ellington found his seat, placing his guitar case carefully in the overhead compartment. He had chosen his spot deliberately, an aisle seat toward the middle of the plane, far enough from the bustling galley yet close enough to stretch his legs without inconvenience. He sank into his seat, letting the faint leather scent of the headrest anchor him. Around him, passengers settled in, exchanging polite nods or distracted smiles. Yet, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that a few glances lingered just a bit too long. It was subtle at first, an older woman in the row ahead shifting her purse closer to her lap. A man 2 rows back whispering something to his seatmate while casting a sidelong glance. These were actions so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Marcus noticed. He always noticed. The flight attendants moved through the aisles. Their practiced smiles warm but distant. One, a tall woman with auburn hair neatly pinned back, paused near Marcus. Her eyes flicked to his guitar case before landing on him. "Sir, is this your bag?" she asked. Her voice professional but clipped. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "Just making sure. Please ensure it's stowed securely," she said, her tone holding an edge of something unspoken. She didn't wait for a response before moving on. Marcus let out a breath, leaning back in his seat. The weight of her question hung in the air, not because of what she had said, but because of how she had said it. He knew the tone well, polite. Almost too polite, as though she were walking a tightrope between professionalism and mistrust. The man seated next to Marcus, a wiry gentleman with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, gave him a fleeting glance before opening a thick paperback. He didn't speak, but his body language was loud enough. He angled himself slightly away, pressing closer to the window, as though proximity itself carried some unspoken risk. Marcus didn't blame him, not directly, at least. Years of navigating spaces like this had taught him that most people didn't even realize what they were doing. Fear, suspicion, discomfort, it was as automatic as breathing. Born of stories told quietly and warnings passed down through generations. The plane filled quickly, the chatter of passengers blending with the occasional beeping of overhead bins being closed. Across the aisle, a young boy twisted in his seat, watching Marcus with open curiosity. His mother reached over, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder and whispering something in his ear. The boy turned back toward the window, his small hands tracing shapes on the glass. Marcus looked away, his gaze settling on the laminated safety card tucked into the seat back pocket. He didn't need to read it, he had flown enough times to know the routine by heart. But it gave him something to focus on, something to hold onto as the whispers continued around him. "Do you think they checked him properly?" a voice murmured behind him. Just loud enough to reach his ears. "I'm sure they did," another replied, though their tone suggested otherwise. The words landed softly, almost weightlessly, but they carried the same sharpness as a jagged stone. Marcus shifted in his seat, his expression impassive. There was no use turning around. Confrontation never worked in situations like this. It only deepened the divide, hardening fears into certainties. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a kind voice interrupted his thoughts. "I love your guitar," said the woman seated across the aisle. She was older, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a loose braid. Her warm smile softened the sharp edges of the moment. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Do you play professionally?" she asked, her interest genuine. "I do," Marcus replied. "Mostly jazz. I'm heading to New York for a performance." Her eyes lit up. "New York, the music capital. You must be very talented." Marcus offered a small smile. "I like to think so." Their brief exchange brought a sense of normalcy, a reminder that not every gaze was laden with judgment. But even as they spoke, he could feel the undercurrent of tension in the cabin. It was a quiet thing, unspoken yet palpable, threading its way through the rows of seats like an invisible tether. As the plane began its ascent, Marcus closed his eyes and rested his head against the seat. Outside the window, the clouds thickened, their edges blurred by the glow of the setting sun. Somewhere in the distance, a city waited for him, its streets alive with the promise of music and movement. For now, he remained suspended, caught between earth and sky, between the weight of others' fears and the strength of his own resolve. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled out, casting a soft, muted glow across the rows of passengers. Marcus Ellington glanced out the window, though his view was obscured by his neighbor's angled body. Beyond the glass, the horizon stretched into a quiet, endless expanse of twilight, a peaceful sight that belied the undercurrent of unease within the plane. He adjusted his posture, careful not to brush against the man beside him. The effort felt like a habit now, instinctive and ingrained. It wasn't about the man. Not really. It was about the space between them. An invisible boundary that Marcus had learned to navigate with precision. Behind him, the whispers began again, just faint enough to blend into the ambient hum of the engines. I don't know. It just seems odd. One voice said. I'm sure they're keeping an eye on him. Replied another, quieter but firm, as if to reassure. Marcus didn't turn. There was no need. He could hear the subtext as clearly as the words themselves. It wasn't anger or hostility, at least. Not overtly. It was something softer, yet sharper. Suspicion dressed as caution. Concern disguised as civility. He shifted his gaze to the aisle. Across from him, the older woman who had complimented his guitar sat reading a dog-eared novel. She didn't look up, but there was something in her posture that suggested she, too, was aware of the murmurs. She glanced his way briefly, her expression unreadable, then returned to her book. Further up the cabin, a flight attendant paused in conversation with a passenger. The exchange seemed routine, a drink order. Perhaps, but Marcus noticed the way her eyes flicked briefly toward his row. It was a fleeting glance, almost imperceptible, but it lingered in his mind like an echo. Do you think he noticed? Another whisper floated from behind. It was softer this time, tinged with something that might have been guilt. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He was no stranger to this. Airports, restaurants, hotel lobbies, the setting changed. But the pattern remained. A misplaced word, a lingering look, a polite tone that carried an edge of something unspoken. It was never enough to confront directly, but always enough to feel. The man beside him shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. Do you fly often? He asked. His tone tentative. Marcus turned, surprised by the question. Fairly often, he replied, keeping his voice neutral. The man nodded, though he didn't meet Marcus's gaze. Work? Something like that, Marcus said. I'm a musician. That seemed to catch the man off guard. He glanced at the guitar case above them, then back at Marcus. Ah, I see. What kind of music? Jazz. Mostly, Marcus said. I've got a show in New York. The man nodded again, a quick, almost mechanical gesture, as though he were processing something unexpected. He opened his mouth as if to say more but closed it again, turning his attention back to his book. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Yet it lingered. Marcus couldn't help but wonder if the man had expected something different, something that fit better with whatever story had been forming in his mind. The murmurs continued sporadically, fading and resurfacing like waves. A few rows back, a man in a crisp business suit leaned toward his seatmate. They spoke in low tones, their words too muffled to decipher. But Marcus didn't need to hear them. He knew their cadence, the way their eyes shifted toward him and quickly away. The older woman across the aisle closed her book, folding her hands over the worn cover. Her gaze rested on Marcus for a moment, steady, thoughtful before she spoke. People can be foolish sometimes, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus looked at her, surprised by the directness of her words. He didn't reply immediately, unsure how to respond. I've seen it before, she continued, her tone matter of fact. People letting their imaginations run wild. They don't mean harm, not always, but that doesn't make it any better. Her words settled over him like a blanket, offering both warmth and weight. He nodded slightly, grateful for her candor but unwilling to unpack the moment further. The plane was still too full of whispers, too heavy with the subtle tension that had been building since takeoff. The engines hummed steadily, carrying them forward into the night. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his fingers resting lightly on his knee. Outside, the horizon had darkened, the last traces of daylight slipping away. Inside, the quiet conflicts of the cabin continued, unseen by some, unavoidable for others. The cabin was quiet, save for the low hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of a page turning. Most passengers were occupied watching movies, flipping through magazines, or simply staring out into the endless expanse of night beyond the windows. The stillness felt fragile, as though it could be broken by the slightest disturbance. And then, it was. A loud thud reverberated through the cabin, sharp and unexpected. Heads turned as a metallic clatter followed, echoing through the narrow space. Marcus looked up, his eyes drawn to the aisle a few rows ahead, where a small toolbox lay splayed open, its contents scattered. A flight attendant hurried over, her voice calm but firm. "Everyone, please remain seated. It's just a maintenance kit that wasn't properly secured." For a moment, it seemed the explanation would suffice. Passengers settled back into their seats, though a few exchanged curious glances. But then, a voice broke the tenuous calm, a voice that carried the sharp edge of suspicion. "Whose is it?" The question came from a man seated near the front, his tone louder than necessary. Marcus recognized him instantly. Alan Price, the businessman who had been whispering earlier. "It shouldn't even be here," Alan continued, leaning forward in his seat. "This is a security risk." The flight attendant straightened, her expression remaining composed. "Sir, I assure you it's been checked. It belongs to the ground crew. And it was left here by mistake." But Alan wasn't satisfied. His eyes swept the cabin, landing on Marcus with unnerving precision. "And how do we know that's true?" he asked, his voice growing louder. "How do we know it's not connected to someone on board?" The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward him, their gazes a mix of curiosity, fear, and something else, something he knew all too well. He didn't move, didn't speak. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his lap, his face calm but unreadable. He had learned long ago that in moments like these, any reaction could be misinterpreted, could be turned into a justification for their suspicions. The flight attendant stepped forward, her tone taking on a firmer edge. "Sir, I need you to remain seated and refrain from making baseless accusations." Alan gestured toward Marcus, his voice sharp. "I'm not accusing anyone, but look around. We all saw what happened back at the checkpoint. Are we just supposed to ignore that?" A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, their expressions conflicted. Others glanced at Marcus, their gazes lingering just a little too long. The older woman across the aisle from Marcus spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough." Her tone was quiet but commanding, carrying the weight of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize injustice when she saw it. "You're scaring people with your nonsense. Let the crew do their job." Alan turned toward her, his face flushing red. "I'm just saying." "You've said enough," she interrupted, her eyes steady and unwavering. "You're making a scene over nothing." The cabin fell silent. Alan opened his mouth as if to reply but seemed to think better of it. He sank back into his seat, his lips pressed into a thin line. The flight attendant gave Marcus a small, almost imperceptible nod before bending to collect the scattered tools. The moment passed, but the air remained heavy, charged with the unspoken. Marcus could feel the stares lingering on him, even as passengers pretended to look away. Rachel, the older woman, leaned slightly toward him. "You don't need to say a word," she murmured, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Some people look for shadows where there are none." Marcus offered her a small, grateful smile. It was a brief exchange, but it carried a quiet power, a reminder that not everyone on this plane saw him as a threat. As the flight attendant returned the toolbox to the galley, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would soon be passing over the Midwest. The routine update seemed almost jarring, a reminder of the ordinary in the midst of the extraordinary. Marcus closed his eyes, his breathing steady. He had spent a lifetime navigating these moments, balancing on the edge of others' assumptions. It was a delicate act, one that required patience, restraint, and a resilience that felt both exhausting and necessary. Outside the window, the stars glimmered faintly, distant and indifferent. Inside the cabin, the tension began to dissipate, replaced by the quiet hum of conversation. But Marcus knew the moment would linger, its echoes carried not by words but by the unspoken truths it revealed. The cabin had quieted again, but it wasn't the same as before. The tension lingered like an aftertaste, a subtle yet persistent reminder of what had just transpired. Passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between their screens, books, or window views. Yet, the invisible thread of unease tied everyone together. Marcus Ellington remained still, his gaze focused on his hands resting in his lap. His calm demeanor was not born of indifference but rather of necessity. Over the years, he had learned that silence often spoke louder than words in moments like these. A quiet strength was his best shield. And now, it was his refuge. Across the aisle, Rachel closed her book, folding her hands over it. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before speaking. Her voice low but clear. "You handled that well," she said, her eyes meeting Marcus's. Marcus offered a faint smile. "It's not the first time. And probably not the last," Rachel replied, her tone carrying a mix of sadness and resolve. "But that doesn't make it right." Their conversation was interrupted by the faint chime of a passenger pressing the call button. The young woman in the row ahead, Mia Jordan, as Marcus had overheard, raised her hand to catch the attention of a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Mia said, her voice polite but firm. "I think it's important we clear something up." The flight attendant, the same one who had addressed Alan earlier, leaned in to listen. Marcus noticed the small tablet Mia held in her hands, its screen glowing faintly. "I was recording earlier," Mia continued, glancing briefly toward Marcus before turning back to the attendant. "Not the whole thing. Just when everyone was going through security. I wanted to show my mom how chaotic airports can get." Her voice was steady, but her posture revealed a flicker of nerves as she tapped on her screen. "But then I saw something. And I think it's relevant." The flight attendant frowned slightly, unsure where Mia was going with this. "Relevant to what, exactly?" "To what happened earlier," Mia said, her voice firmer now. "The toolbox. The accusations. It's all connected, isn't it?" The attendant hesitated, clearly wary of encouraging more cabin drama. But Mia didn't wait for permission. She turned her screen so the attendant and anyone nearby could see. "It's from the terminal," Mia explained. "This man," she pointed at Marcus without hesitation, was helping an elderly woman who dropped her things near security. You can see him handing her belongings back. The image was grainy but clear enough. Marcus was there, his guitar case slung over one shoulder, bending down to pick up a scarf that had fallen to the floor. His posture was unmistakably kind, his expression calm. Mia swiped to the next clip. "And here," she added, "you can see the maintenance worker with the same toolbox. He walked past me on his way to the jet bridge." The faint murmur of passengers grew louder as the revelation spread. Alan, seated several rows ahead, turned halfway in his seat, his expression tightening. He looked less certain now, though he said nothing. The flight attendant straightened, her professional calm unwavering as she nodded. "Thank you for sharing this. I'll make sure it's noted." Mia leaned back, satisfied but not smug. Her actions carried no air of triumph, just a quiet determination to set the record straight. Marcus, for his part, met her gaze and gave her a slight nod, an unspoken gesture of gratitude. But not everyone was ready to let the moment pass. Alan finally spoke, his voice hesitant but audible. "I wasn't accusing anyone directly," he said, his words carefully measured. "I was just concerned." Rachel, who had been silent until now, turned to face him fully. "Concerned about what, exactly?" she asked, her voice sharp but controlled. "You pointed fingers without any proof. What were you really worried about?" Alan's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, his gaze falling to the carpeted aisle. The weight of Rachel's question hung in the air, unanswered but undeniably present. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The unease was still there, but now it was tinged with something else, a quiet acknowledgement. Perhaps even a hint of regret. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a step towards something better. As the flight attendant moved back toward the galley, the hum of conversation slowly returned. People whispered in softer tones now, their gazes less intrusive. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself in the steady rhythm of the engines. The truth, as fleeting as it often felt, had a way of surfacing in moments like these. It didn't erase the harm, nor did it guarantee change. But it was a start, a small, quiet victory in a space where silence often spoke the loudest. The plane hummed steadily as the captain announced their progress over the Midwest. Below them, the world was a patchwork of lights, small towns dotting the vast darkness. Inside the cabin, The atmosphere had shifted subtly. The tension from earlier had ebbed, replaced by a quiet unease, as though the weight of unspoken truths still lingered in the air. Marcus Ellington sat in his aisle seat, his guitar case now tucked securely above him. He kept his gaze forward, not out of defiance, but out of a practiced patience. Years of living with others' assumptions had taught him that calmness could often disarm even the harshest judgment. Alan Price, seated a few rows ahead, fidgeted in his seat. His eyes darted toward Marcus occasionally, though he quickly looked away each time. He was no longer the center of attention, but the memory of his earlier outburst hung over him like a shadow. The unease on his face wasn't anger, it was something quieter: shame. Perhaps, or discomfort with the reflection of his own actions. Rachel, the older woman across the aisle, noticed Alan's restlessness. She leaned slightly toward Marcus and spoke in a low voice. "Do you think he'll apologize?" Marcus hesitated, considering her question. He didn't want to assume, nor did he want to hope for something that might not come. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but that's up to him." Rachel nodded thoughtfully, her expression pensive. "Sometimes people need time to face themselves," she said. "It's not always about you. You know, it's about their own struggle." Her words hung in the air, poignant and true. Marcus offered her a faint smile, appreciating her wisdom. She seemed to sense the nuances of moments like these in a way that felt rare and refreshing. As the flight attendants began their final round of the cabin, Alan finally stood. He hesitated for a moment, smoothing his shirt as though trying to collect himself. Then, to Marcus's quiet surprise, he stepped into the aisle and approached. "Excuse me," Alan said, his voice low but audible. The surrounding passengers turned their attention subtly, ears tuned to the interaction while pretending to be otherwise occupied. Marcus looked up, his expression neutral but open. "Yes?" Alan hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For earlier." The words were awkward, stilted, but they carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Alan glanced down at his shoes before meeting Marcus's gaze again. "I jumped to conclusions. And that wasn't fair. It wasn't right. I let my assumptions get the better of me." Marcus studied him for a moment, his face calm. He could see the effort it had taken for Alan to approach him, to admit his fault in front of a cabin full of witnesses. It wasn't easy to confront one's own biases, especially in such a public way. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, his voice steady and measured. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Alan nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I appreciate that. I'll try to do better." The moment was brief but significant. Alan returned to his seat, his shoulders less tense than before. The surrounding passengers seemed to relax as well, their collective discomfort softening in the wake of the apology. Rachel leaned toward Marcus again, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was decent of him." Marcus nodded. "It's a start." For the remainder of the flight, the cabin settled into a quieter rhythm. The whispers from earlier had faded, replaced by the gentle murmur of casual conversations and the occasional rustle of a page turning. Marcus let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his own body begin to ease. Outside the window, the stars shone faintly, distant yet steady. Their light was soft, almost imperceptible against the darkness. But it was there, constant, unwavering. Marcus found comfort in their presence, a reminder that even in the most challenging moments, there was always a glimmer of hope. As the plane continued its journey, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The apology hadn't erased the harm, nor had it changed the reality of the world he lived in. But it was a small, quiet step towards something better. And for now, that was enough. The cabin had grown quieter as the flight entered its final stretch. Many passengers had drifted into a light sleep, lulled by the steady hum of the engines and the soft glow of overhead lights. Outside, the darkness remained, vast and unbroken, a canvas of night. Marcus Ellington sat in his seat, hands resting lightly on his knees. His gaze was unfocused, staring ahead but not truly seeing. He was lost in thought, replaying the events of the flight in his mind, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet need to process. Across the aisle, Rachel stirred. She had dozed off briefly. But now her eyes opened. Clear and alert. She looked toward Marcus, studying him for a moment before speaking. "You've been very patient," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of understanding. Marcus turned to her, offering a small smile. "I've had practice." Rachel nodded. "I imagine you had to." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But that doesn't make it any less exhausting. Does it?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, letting the question settle. "No," he admitted finally. "It doesn't, but I've learned how to carry it." Her expression softened. "That's a heavy burden to bear." Marcus shrugged lightly. "We all carry something." The simplicity of his words struck Rachel. She leaned back, her hands resting in her lap as she considered his answer. "You know," she said after a moment. "There was a time when I didn't see these things." "Not really." Marcus raised an eyebrow, curious. "What changed?" "My grandchildren," she replied with a small smile. "They see the world differently. They talk about things I never thought much about when I was younger. Race, fairness, equity. They challenge me, make me think." She glanced at him, her gaze steady. "It's not always comfortable, but I'm grateful for it. They've taught me to pay attention to things I once ignored." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's a gift," he said, "being willing to learn, even when it's uncomfortable." Rachel smiled. "It is. And it's made me realize how much I still have to unlearn." Their conversation lapsed into a comfortable silence. Around them, the cabin stirred faintly as a flight attendant passed with a tray of water cups. Marcus accepted one with a polite nod. The cool plastic a welcome contrast to the warmth of his thoughts. A few rows ahead, Alan sat stiffly in his seat, his posture upright but his gaze distant. He hadn't spoken much since his apology, though it was clear he was still turning the events over in his mind. At one point, he glanced back toward Marcus, his expression uncertain, almost hesitant. Mia, the young woman with the tablet, leaned over toward her seatmate, her voice low but audible. "It's just so unfair," she said, her tone tinged with frustration. "Why does this kind of thing still happen?" Her seatmate, an older man with a kind face, nodded. "It's complicated," he said, "but complicated doesn't mean it can't change." Mia glanced toward Marcus, her expression thoughtful. "I hope so," she murmured, "because people like him shouldn't have to keep going through this." Marcus heard her, though he didn't turn. Her words were sincere, heartfelt, but they carried a weight that made him both hopeful and weary. Change, he knew, was never as simple as wanting it. It required effort, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Rachel broke the silence between them again. "Do you ever get tired of teaching people?" she asked gently. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but it's not really about teaching. Is it? It's about living. People see what they choose to see. All I can do is be myself." She nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "That's a powerful lesson in itself." As the plane began its gradual descent, the cabin lights brightened slightly, signaling the end of the journey. Marcus looked out the window, the faint glow of city lights now visible against the darkness. Somewhere below, New York waited, its streets alive with movement and possibility. Rachel leaned toward him one last time. "Thank you," she said quietly. He turned to her, surprised. "For what?" "For being you," she replied simply. "For reminding people like me that we still have more to learn." Her words stayed with him as the plane touched down, its wheels skimming the runway with a soft thud. They were simple words, yet they carried a resonance that felt profound. Marcus tightened his grip on the armrest, his heart steady, his mind calm. The journey wasn't over, not for him, not for Rachel, not for anyone, but in that moment, there was a sense of something shifting, however small, and for Marcus, that was enough. For now, the plane taxied to its gate, its slow crawl mirrored by the passengers preparing to disembark. Seat belts clicked open, overhead bins creaked as they were pulled apart, and the cabin filled with the muted sounds of people gathering their belongings. Marcus Ellington stayed seated, his guitar case still tucked safely above him. There was no rush. He watched the other passengers, their movements hurried but orderly. The tension from earlier had dissipated. replaced by the collective relief that came with the end of a journey. Yet, beneath the surface, Marcus sensed that the events of the flight lingered in their minds. Just as they lingered in his. Across the aisle, Rachel leaned over and touched his arm lightly. "Safe travels, Marcus," she said, her voice warm. He smiled at her, grateful. "You too, Rachel. Take care." She nodded, her expression thoughtful, before standing and joining the slow-moving line in the aisle. As she left, Marcus felt a quiet sense of gratitude for her presence. She had been an unexpected ally. Her kindness a small but significant balm against the sting of earlier events. Alan, the businessman, stood a few rows ahead, his posture stiff as he waited to exit. He glanced back at Marcus briefly, his expression a mixture of unease and something else, perhaps regret. He didn't say anything more, but the slight nod he offered was acknowledgement enough. Marcus returned the gesture, understanding that words weren't always. As the line thinned, Marcus finally stood, pulling his guitar case from the overhead bin with practiced ease. He slung it over his shoulder, its familiar weight grounding him. The flight attendant who had intervened earlier was standing near the exit. Her professional smile tinged with what seemed. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her tone. Marcus met her eyes, offering a small, understanding smile. "Thank." Stepping off the plane, Marcus felt the rush of cool air from the jet bridge. It was a subtle but welcome change, a reminder that the journey was behind him. As he walked through the terminal, the sounds of the airport filled his ears, announcements echoing, footsteps on polished floors, snippets of conversation in various tones and languages. He paused briefly near a large window overlooking the runway. Planes taxied in the distance, their lights blinking against the darkness. The city's skyline loomed beyond, a patchwork of lights and shadows. Marcus stood there for a moment, letting the stillness of the scene settle over him. "Excuse me," a voice said from behind. He turned to see Mia, the young woman who had shown the video during the flight. She was holding her tablet in one hand, her carry-on in the other. Her expression was earnest, her gaze steady. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "For staying calm, for handling everything the way you did. It made me realize how much more I need to pay attention." Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty. "It's not always easy," he said, "but moments like these, they matter." Mia smiled, her eyes softening. "They do. I'll remember this." She hesitated, as though wanting to say more, before giving him a small wave and continuing toward the baggage claim. Marcus watched her go, feeling a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something, a spark in the darkness. As he made his way toward the exit, the weight of the day began to lift. The world outside the airport was waiting, chaotic and unpredictable, but also full of possibility. Marcus tightened his grip on the strap of his guitar case. Music would carry him forward, as it always had, giving voice to things words couldn't capture. Walking through the automatic doors, he stepped into the cool night air. The city's sounds greeted him, horns honking, conversations spilling from passing cars, the distant wail of a siren. It was alive, restless, and vibrant. For Marcus, the journey wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the spaces in between, the fleeting connections, the small acts of courage, the moments of reflection that made the burdens lighter, if only for a while. And as he blended into the rhythm of the city, he carried with him the quiet hope that these moments, however small, would ripple outward. The world wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close, but it could be better. And sometimes, that was enough.